There is something that happens in certain moments that don't seem to follow the rules of ordinary psychological effects or even physiologic effects. The person who's been working on something for years, they've had real insight, they've had real self awareness, real effort, and then something shifts, not in the session, not through a new framework. It's in a moment of prayer or silence in nature or being in a community meditation session. It's a release that happens that months of analysis couldn't touch. And I want to say this immediately. The same quality of shift sometimes happens in therapy or in somatic work or in a relationship that feels safe enough or in a medical, when we're doing vitamin therapy, it just happens. The quality I'm pointing towards is not exclusive to a spiritual context. What these states of opening offer is a different relationship to the healing process itself. And it's one that is more than just our individual will or the will of the clinician. Spiritual practice is a reliable route into them and one that appears repeatedly across many, many different populations. Today on Ask Dr. Gill, I want to talk about spirituality as a context for healing, both the physical and the psychological, because I think it's an important aspect that we miss in our evidence based medicine paradigm. So stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Ask Dr. Gill. I am your host, Dr. Gill Winkleman, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really happy you're here to talk about this. This is actually uh, a topic that I'm very passionate about because I think that we don't talk enough about things that don't have a scientific basis, and even the things in the in naturopathy that I use, all of them have a scientific foundation. Whether that's in the physiology or specific to the protocols, there's a scientific foundation to them. And the science and spirituality, we're getting there. I mean, I've talked on the program in the past about the power of prayer for healing. And today I want to dive into something that's a little different than what we've talked about on the show or I've written about that I think is really important. And we're going to talk about an idea around surrender, which I'll get to in a minute. I've seen this many times where people have a breakthrough all of a sudden. It's an insight. They go for a hike in the wood or they go on a backpacking trip or they go to a meditation group, whatever it is, prayer group, and something happens. And this is the thesis I'd like to explore. There are modes of experience that cannot be reached through self management alone. And that's the basic idea that I think this is the basic conclusion that I'm coming to. Everything else in this episode is an attempt to say what those modes are and why they matter and how the spiritual practice has been one reliable route across cultures and centuries. But I want to say it's not an argument that spiritual practice is necessary for healing, nor am I arguing about any specific practices. I want to be really clear about that. Healing happens through many pathways. And what I've seen is that different people reach the same destination along different routes and with different practitioners. And sometimes it's the same protocol, but it worked better with one practitioner versus another. Don't ask me to explain that one because I don't get it. What I'm saying here, though, is that there are states that happen that allow for something to shift that I don't think I have a understanding for. And sometimes it happened when someone stopped trying to be the sole author of their healing. So let me start with the evidence because I want to talk about that a little bit. Research traditions have pointed in the same direction. Meaning matters. People who can place suffering within a larger framework often recover more fully. And it's not just saying, "Oh, everything happens for a reason," by the way. It's like having something that is meaningful to you. It it you know, belonging matters. Loneliness, by the way, is one of the most reliable predictors of poor health outcomes. And we've talked about that on the show. Kaveen Mistry and I had a conversation about his book, which also talks about spiritual practices, by the way. Contemplative practices often change our physiology. There are measurable effects that in our autonomic regulation, in our stress response, in our brains, in fact. Interestingly, as a little piece to this, what they found when they did scans of people's brains who did mindfulness meditation practices is they were assuming that things would shut down, in terms of like the thoughts, like those would be slower. That isn't what changed. What changed was what's called the default mode network, which may be what we would call the ego. Like it's the part of us that sort of controls things and decides what to pay attention to. And that area changes drastically as a result of long-term meditation. So it's not that your thinking changes, it's the quality of what you pay attention to that changes. And I think that belonging to a faith community or having a regular practice appears to change our relationship to what is going on, to our nervous system, to our thinking. And that's, I think, that is not necessarily indirectly in the research, but I think that it shows that it's a reduction in terms of isolated self-management to a greater container, and it becomes a different orientation, if you will. Now, the research doesn't really fully tell us why, right? There's sometimes it has to do with a lack of isolation or managing chronic stress load, possibly nervous system regulation. Broader health psychology literature on meaning, resilience, and post-traumatic growth shows a consistent finding. People who can place their suffering within a larger frame, which is a story that gives it meaning without requiring it to be good. That's the important piece here, I think. Tend to recover more fully than people who can't do that. Spiritual traditions often provide that frame. And I think that's something that's important to pay attention to. What the research can't fully account for, and what I've found compelling in my practice, is the phenomenology, the quality of what people report when there is a shift. And I think that I want to be careful not to imply passivity here, by the way. People are still showing up, they're still practicing. There's a difference, though, because the effort stops being, I'll say, managerial. I mean, there's something being done, but there's a lack of pushing. And I don't have a full explanation for this. And I don't know if anyone does, but I want to talk about that and more here. And we'll get to that in a minute. I want to connect what the research shows to something I've been observing for a long time clinically. Some forms of healing require states that the effortful, managing mind struggles to produce consistently on its own. For example, genuine openness. Like you don't just think, "Oh, I'm going to have an open heart," right? Or be open to someone. It just happens. It's almost like a lack of trying, or deep rest, or the release of chronic bracing, right? These are ordinary human experiences that many of us have lost access to. And I think spiritual practices may be the pathway for us to find them again, right? It's about putting the phone down and just being bored. I mean, there's been some articles about that, by the way, recently. Time in nature, deeply satisfying and safe relationships. Some of these are somatic work. Some of these are awe experiences, right? The specific pathway matters less than the function. It's accessing states where the protective self-organization briefly releases and something else becomes possible. It it allows something else to enter. There's a part of us that monitors, manages, performs, controls everything in our life. Call it self-protective if you want. But it's the same structure that's running the unsafety setting in our nervous system, the settings of having to manage everything all the time. And it's not a villain, by the way. It's an intelligent adaptation. It's a structure that was built for protection, and possibly because that's what you learned from your family growing up. But it has a cap, right? That the ceiling is this: the protective self-organization cannot release what it is protecting with the same effort that is used to protect it, right? Sit with that for a minute. Many protective responses originate in systems that operate faster than conscious thought. They're below areas that we even recognize. Conscious insight can change how we relate to them, but it doesn't immediately update the old predictions because those are in the nervous system and are still running. Understanding the pattern is the managing mind doing its job really well. Mapping the wound, really helpful. But the release, what feels like the deeper updating, requires something different. And by the way, this is not a critique of effort. Some people need that structure, they need that agency. And sometimes you need that because it feels like you're able to control the instability or the chaos, right? It's only when the managing it leaves you unavailable to move beyond whatever that ceiling is because the grip is so tight. So the person who understands exactly why they cannot, a person can understand why they don't trust, but then maybe not be able to relax into the intimacy. And, I've seen this with veterans. They intellectually know they are home, but their body scans for every exit. Or, if a firecracker goes off, they think that's an explosive, a bomb. This is stuff that is deep within us, right? Knowing it intellectually doesn't necessarily solve it. And these aren't failures of the insight. They're the failures of you're in the wrong place. What spiritual practice may be doing is helping you navigate that other area, right? And so that grip can then loosen, and it's a different kind of orientation. Now, there's a term that I will borrow from Carolyn Mace, and we're going to talk more about this in terms of her definition, and that is surrender. And I want to distinguish this. Actually, I'm going to take a quick break, and on the second half of the show, we're going to talk about the concept of surrender and what it is and what it isn't. So stay. Hello and welcome back to Ask Dr. Gill. I am your host, Dr. Gil Winkleman. So let's jump back into the topic about spirituality because I want to talk about there's an idea called surrender. And Carolyn Mace talks a lot about this in her work. And I really, really appreciate her contribution in this regard. I mean, it's probably predates her, but the way she talks about this. And I want to say something about that phrase because I'm going to be using it throughout this episode. And I want to make sure that you understand what I mean by it. And what it isn't, I'm going to talk about this first. It's not resignation. Resignation is this idea of I give up, nothing will change. It's a state of collapse or deflation. And it's the orientation of someone who basically stopped believing anything is possible. Not cynicism, although cynicism sometimes mimics it, resignation. The second is what I'd call coerced submission. And this is the demand to surrender that certain religious groups have used as a form of control. And, if you're told you have to submit, you have to accept, you must not question, anytime compliance is enforced by either rejection or punishment or the threat of those, I want to bring this up because I imagine some of my listeners have wounds related to these types of experiences, right? And so the word surrender might carry a heavy weight, but I think it's important to recognize that genuine surrender, the type where release of control is voluntary and unforced and comes from a place of strength rather than defeat. It's a place of, I know little me cannot handle this. It's allowing something larger to hold you, right? Whether that's a community or a practice or a presence, it's something beyond just you. And it's not about giving up, right? You're still participating in the experience. It's just not trying to force the outcome. It's not a passivity. What it is you're releasing control and you're releasing the how, and maybe you're releasing what it looks like too, right? Because oftentimes we have an expectation of what healing will look like, right? And there's a doctor I worked with. It was funny, and the patient asked her, "Hey," he was there for a weight loss program, I think it was, and he says, "Hey, can you make me look like Brad Pitt?" And she's like, "Yeah, I'm not that good," right? I mean, we're not going to look like a supermodel or something necessarily, and that's okay, right? That each of us has our own path, and surrender is into that path. Over time, the body often experiences the difference between resignation and surrender differently, right? Resignation could be a slumping or a heaviness. Genuine surrender is, I would say, more of an opening. And it's a softening of that bracing that many of us carry. So, one important thing I want to bring up, and we'll talk about this in a later podcast, collapse can masquerade as surrender. Dissociation can look like transcendence. Mania can look like release, but there's no resolution, right? Genuine surrender is different. You're releasing control of the mechanism, but you're still responsible for the process. And the difference shows up, and this is my observation, is the person more present and more genuinely connected to something? The managing mind is really good at analysis and it's really good at protection. And some forms of healing require us to let go of that. And I think spiritual practice, or some of the pathways I've learned, it doesn't necessarily replace that. It doesn't necessarily it certainly doesn't replace many of the treatments that we might use, right? Or the psychological work. But for some people, letting go of the mental chatter, that's where the repair starts to happen. So let's talk about what connecting to something larger can produce, right? Three things that I've seen consistently, and the research partially supports this, by the way. But I don't think the secular models capture this completely. So, uh, a spiritual practice reduces the physiologic cost of effortful control, right? Your nervous system, when you're trying to control everything all the time, it basically creates this constant vigilance, which is actually using up energy in your system, right? And that chronic work of monitoring, managing, performing creates a toll on the body, not because anything's wrong, but that it's just like running your car battery, leaving when the car's not started, eventually it'll drain the battery. Contemplative practice or some kind of prayer or other ritual seems to reduce this toll in ways that just resting doesn't do, right? It's the body gets permission to stop trying to do stuff. And I've actually seen this. The research on meditation and prayer shows measurable effects on cortisol change and autonomic nervous tone and inflammatory markers. We don't understand the mechanism, but there's something here. The other thing about spiritual practice is it can often provide a meaning container for suffering. And I think one of the most important things that people with chronic issues, whether that's psychological or health, is that having a meaning for this creates a resiliency. And the people who can place their suffering in a larger frame seem to have better resiliency. It's a story that gives it meaning without it requiring to be good or right. Spiritual traditions have been providing frames for as long as people have been suffering. I mean, probably religion is one of the oldest things on the planet, right? In one form or another. And the function is very consistent. It's about understanding how the world is happening and understanding why good things happen and why bad things happen and why good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people. I mean, it creates context that rather than life being random. And it's not the same as spiritual bypassing, by the way, which is usually about avoiding feelings. And I'll talk about that more next week. It's different. The genuine meaning making follows a feeling rather than replacing it. It's feeling your grief, it's feeling your anger, and then something can shift. The other thing about spiritual practice is it offers a relational regulation at a different scale. And I've talked about the importance of a relational experience for, co-regulation in terms of helping the nervous system. The nervous system can update through accumulated, repeated contact with some regulated other. And sometimes the spiritual practice or community actually provides that. Belonging to a group is part of that. But sometimes it's just believing in something bigger than yourself that you can relate to. There's something about that, and particularly, the research talks about the collective aspect of this. But nervous systems don't just orient and don't reorganize with one-on-one attachment. It can also help with being in a stable group identity. The isolation that many nervous system patterns encode can soften when you're in a group. And this has been, you know, talked about, and I've talked about this on the show, and I talked about it with Kaveen Mistry in terms of the Blue Zones research and his primal health stuff too. that is probably, in fact, I think we talked about how it's the biggest predictor of morbidity or mortality rather, is how many close relationships you have. And some of those people get in spiritual communities. So if you grew up in a religious tradition that was harmful or shaming or controlling, where surrender was demanded as opposed to suggested, this episode may be landing in a complicated way. And the concept of spiritual tradition and spiritual practice, there's a weight to it. And I get that. And that's real. And I want to acknowledge that. What I'm describing isn't that. The surrender I'm pointing towards is not a submission to a theology or an institution. Uh, it's an internal orientation. It's a willingness to allow something outside of your own personal self to take you somewhere. And it doesn't have to happen in a religious context. It can happen outside of one. Does this require the belief in a supreme being? Not necessarily. I mean, what's interesting about the longevity and health research across traditions is they have really different theological ideas across those traditions. What matters is the orientation, not the specifics of it. Some people believe in a God or a higher power. Other people believe in nature. And the fact that they're part of something else, that's, I think, the important piece. It's understanding that we're part of a system, right? And for others, it's focusing on the community or the service or the practice of gratitude. This doesn't require certainty either. Like, being able to hold the mystery of something often is itself a form of surrender. The last thing I want to say is not everyone arrives at this dimension of healing at the same time or through the same door. Some people work through the physiologic layers first and find a spiritual connection. Some people do the spiritual work and then start to go into the physiological or the psychological work. And there's no right or wrong pathway about this, right? And the absence of a strong spiritual practice right now is not evidence of being stuck at the ego level, by the way. It's just a doorway through to a different way of organizing your life. I think that some nervous systems are not resisting surrender psychologically, right? They are responding physiologically to something that is unsafe, right? Unsafe environments, feeling that there's an ongoing threat, feeling like there's harm that can come at some point. Surrender isn't the right direction for everybody. I want to be clear about that. Safety first before the openness. And I think that if you're in that place where you can open, many people, it happens spontaneously. I'm going to leave you with 3 questions again. Do you have a practice? That's the first one. Any practice that you are regularly placing yourself in relationship to something larger than yourself and outside of yourself. It doesn't matter what it's called. We have a joke here on island that surfing, people will be out in the lineup and they'll say, "This is my church," right? It There's something very amazing about being out on the water and riding waves, and that's a spiritual experience. Is there something you do regularly that involves an intentional release of effort? Where in your healing work do you feel the ceiling of your own understanding and effort can reach? And what is that thing that the insight hasn't moved? And finally, what would surrender look like to you? Not resignation and not submission, but genuine release. And what would you need to trust for that to feel possible? There's a kind of healing that happens at the edge of what the self can't do alone. And many of us spend a long time trying to discover what this is. Not because we're doing it wrong, but because the effort and the insight are real and they have a place, but they don't necessarily touch the areas that need to be touched. And sometimes we're invited into areas that will lead to our healing. It's not that you necessarily become a faith healer, by the way, or believe in that. That's not what I'm saying. It's an yes and situation, right? And however the invitation to this higher thing arrives, allow it. If it happens, allow it and step into it and feel it. Some people reach forms of change through surrender that insight alone can't produce, not because the insight failed, but because there's a different quality of engagement. So that's what I got for you today. Next week, I'm going to talk more about this in terms of spiritual bypassing, because I think the two of these go hand in hand, right? And if you haven't taken the quiz, there's a link in the show notes. It would be great if you take it and you can see kind of where you are in the pathway in terms of where your healing journey goes next. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I will see you next time.